The keys were lying on the wrong deed. Their brass edges pressed dense into a page bearing my name, but the signature beneath it was not mine. The metal felt cold when I touched it, too cold for a room where the air conditioner hummed against the late summer heat. My mother's gardenia perfume hung over the conference table, sweet enough to coat the back of my throat, while my sister's satin garment bag whispered against her chair every time she moved. Brielle had come straight from her final wedding dress fitting. A strand of blonde hair had escaped her neat twist, and a white ribbon was still tied around her wrist. She placed 2 fingers on my key ring. "Your wedding gift to me will be the lake house," Brielle said. My mother clapped once. The sound cracked through the title attorney's office. "Oh, honey," Helen said. "That is perfect." Nobody looked surprised except Ethan. Brielle's fiancé sat beside her with one hand wrapped around a paper coffee cup. His grip tightened until the lid made a soft popping sound. I placed my palm over the keys and pulled them across the deed toward me. The teeth scraped over the paper. Brielle's smile thinned. At 38, I had spent most of my working life examining what pressure did to buildings. As a structural engineer, I inspected lakefront homes after floods, foundation shifts, and years of owners pretending that a widening crack was only cosmetic. My family had cracks like that. They simply preferred better lighting. "Allison," Brielle said, "don't make this awkward." "You put my keys on a transfer document," I said. It was already awkward. My father leaned back in his chair. Douglas Mercer had perfected that posture when I was a child. Chin lifted, shoulders wide. Silence used like a locked door. "The house should stay in the family," Douglas said. "It is in the family," I said. Brielle gave a small laugh and looked toward Ethan, inviting him to join her. He did not. "You live there alone," she said. 6 bedrooms, Allison, 6. You don't have a husband. You don't have children. Half the rooms are empty." "They aren't." "Oh, please." Brielle released the keys and sat back. "One is an office. One has exercise equipment. One has boxes. You've turned a family home into storage because you can't admit it's too much house for one person." My mother reached across the table and touched Brielle's wrist. "Your sister isn't saying you don't deserve a home," Helen told me. Her voice had softened, which meant witnesses mattered. "She's saying this house could begin a marriage. It could hold children, holidays, a real family life." The tendon in my injured leg tightened beneath the table. An old reflex. My heel pressed into the carpet until the ache settled. Daniel Price, the title attorney, adjusted the certified report in front of him but said nothing. He had introduced himself 10 minutes earlier in a neutral voice, apologized for the delay, and explained that he had received additional county records that morning. He was not my attorney. He was not Brielle's. That seemed to bother my mother more than she wanted him to notice. Brielle pushed a black pen toward me. "You said you'd think about it," she said. "I said to send me what you expected me to sign. And we did." "No, you sent documents to a title company." Helen folded her hands. Her wedding ring clicked against the table. "Because adults prepare paperwork before important meetings," she said. "Your sister's wedding is in 3 weeks. The lender needs certainty." I looked at Brielle. "Who told the lender I agreed to transfer my house?" The room went still. Even the air conditioner seemed louder. Ethan slowly set down his coffee. "What does she mean?" he asked. Brielle's eyes stayed on mine. "She means she wants to turn a generous family plan into an interrogation." "That isn't what I asked," I said. Douglas leaned forward. "We explained that the property has always been treated as a family asset," he said. "You know that." Daniel stopped turning pages. "What exactly was represented to the lender?" he asked. Helen's head turned toward him. Her smile remained, but the skin beside her mouth tightened. "Mr. Price, this is really about timing," Helen said. "The wedding deposits are already paid. Brielle and Ethan need the house in place so the financing can proceed smoothly." Daniel picked up the certified deed. "It is about title," he said. "Timing comes after title." He turned to the final page. My father's right thumb began rubbing the side of his index finger. A small motion. Easy to miss unless you had watched him sign checks, loan papers, and court filings for most of your life. Daniel glanced at me, then at Douglas. "Mr. Mercer, can you explain the reference to Mercer versus Mercer?" My father's thumb stopped. Helen answered before he could. "That was an old family dispute," she said. It was settled years ago and has no bearing on Brielle's wedding. Daniel slid the deed toward Douglas. It may have bearing on the affidavit submitted with this transfer packet. The paper moved across the polished table with a dry hiss. Brielle looked from Daniel to my father. "What affidavit?" she asked. Douglas did not answer. Daniel placed one finger beneath a line near the bottom of the page. "This conveyance was made pursuant to a consent judgment and constructive trust order," he said. The next sentence states that the grantors retained no legal or equitable interest in the property. My father read the line. His shoulders remained square, but the color above his collar began to drain. He read it again. That second reading told me more than any confession could have. The deed was 8 years old. Douglas knew every word on it. What frightened him was not the sentence itself. It was whatever he had signed recently that contradicted it. Helen reached for the deed. "We don't need to reopen ancient history," she said. Daniel placed his hand flat on the page before she could take it. "I need the document to remain where it is." My mother's hand withdrew. Brielle picked up the pen and held it out to me. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Sign the new deed and none of that matters anymore." Ethan turned toward her. "You told me Allison had already agreed." "She did," Brielle said. "No," I said. Brielle's fingers tightened around the pen. "You said you would consider helping me." "I considered it. And? I never agreed to give you my home." The pen struck the table when Brielle dropped it. Helen inhaled through her nose. "You are destroying your sister's wedding over a house you never should have kept," she said. A pulse jumped beneath my jaw, but my voice stayed level. "Daniel, preserve every document your office received. The attachments, the original emails, the authorization forms, and the affidavits." Helen's chair creaked. "For crying out loud, Allison," she said. "Preserve them for what?" Daniel closed the folder. "I will retain the file," he said. Brielle shoved back from the table. Satin rustled inside the garment bag behind her. "You planned this," she said. "You came here to humiliate me." I wrapped my fingers around the keys. "No," I said. "You brought my house, my keys, and a pen. I came to find out how far you were willing to go." 3 months earlier, I had been standing inside a storm-damaged cottage 40 miles north, tapping a moisture meter against a warped support beam when my phone rang. The woman on the line introduced herself as a closing coordinator. Rain struck the temporary roof above me. Damp wood and lake mud filled the room. My work glove left a gray streak across the phone screen when I answered. "I'm calling to confirm the property gift from Allison Mercer to Brielle Mercer," the woman said. My hand stopped against the beam. "I haven't agreed to any property gift," I told her. There was a pause. Papers shifted on the other end. Then the woman lowered her voice. "Miss Mercer, we already have your signed gift affidavit." The closing coordinator's words stayed in my ear after the call ended. "We already have your signed gift affidavit." Rain hammered the temporary roof above me. Water dripped somewhere behind the open drywall with a slow, hollow tap. My glove had gone damp around the fingertips, and the moisture meter pressed a hard plastic ridge into my palm. I stood inside a storm-damaged cottage on Lake Marlowe, staring at a support post that had shifted almost half an inch off center. The post was not the problem anymore. "Miss Mercer?" A contractor called from the adjoining room. "Do you want us to brace the west wall today?" I looked down at the time on my phone and wrote it on the top corner of my inspection sheet, 10:42 in the morning. Then I wrote the caller's name, company, and direct extension exactly as she had given them. "Yes," I called back. "Brace it before anyone removes another section of drywall." The contractor stepped through the doorway, boots grinding wet grit into the subfloor. "Something wrong?" "Someone filed paperwork using my name." His eyebrows rose, but he did not ask for details. That was one reason I liked job sites. A damaged beam did not pretend to be healthy. Rot did not ask you to protect its reputation. Pressure traveled where physics sent it, and sooner or later, every hidden weakness showed itself. I finished the inspection before making another call. By late afternoon, the rain had faded to a cold mist. My truck tires hissed over the lakeside road as I drove home. Maple branches leaned over the asphalt, heavy with water, and the air coming through the cracked window smelled of mud, wet leaves, and gasoline from a marina farther down the shore. My lake house appeared through the trees, one section at a time. First the dark roofline, then the stone chimney, then the wide front windows reflecting gray water. Brielle liked to talk about the 6 bedrooms as if I wandered through them every night counting empty pillows. In truth, only 2 rooms held beds. 1 bedroom was mine, another was for guests. The room facing east held drafting tables, rolled plans, soil reports, and samples of corroded fasteners from old waterfront structures. A smaller room contained exercise equipment I used to keep my injured legs strong. Another had been converted into a reading room, with built-in shelves and a worn leather chair beside the window. The last room stored field equipment, safety gear, and boxed records I refused to leave in an office, shared with anyone else. Nothing was empty. More important, nothing was Brielle's. I entered through the mudroom and set my wet boots on the rubber mat. The house answered with familiar sounds. The soft rush of the heating system. The refrigerator motor starting in the kitchen. Wind brushing loose leaves across the deck. My cell phone rang before I reached the sink. Brielle's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey," Brielle said. Music and female voices echoed behind her. "Are you at home?" "Yes." "Good. I need the parcel number for the lake house." I took a dish towel from the counter and dried rainwater from my hands. "Why?" "The wedding planner needs it." I folded the towel once. "Why would a wedding planner need a parcel number?" A burst of laughter rose behind Brielle, followed by the clink of glasses. "For permits," she said. "Guest limits, parking, that kind of thing. The wedding is not being held here. It might be easier if we moved some events there." "We never discussed that." Brielle exhaled into the phone. "Allison, I'm trying to solve problems. I don't need every question turned into a deposition. What problem requires my parcel number?" The planner asked for property information. "What information?" A cabinet door closed on Brielle's end. "Insurance, the deed. Maybe a recent assessment." My fingers stopped on the towel. "A wedding planner asked you for a copy of my deed?" "She wants to make sure vendors are covered." "Give me her name." Silence stretched long enough for the heating system to click off. "I don't have it in front of me," Brielle said. "You're speaking to her now." "I'm with her assistant." "Give me the assistant's name." Brielle's voice sharpened. "Why are you being difficult?" "Because none of those documents are needed for floral delivery or parking." The background noise suddenly faded. She had walked away from the others. "Mom said you would make this weird," Brielle said. "Mom knew you were calling?" "She knows I'm handling the house details." "There are no house details." Another silence. Then Brielle laughed. But the sound had no warmth in it. "Fine," she said. "Forget I asked." She ended the call. I set the phone beside the sink and looked through the kitchen windows at the lake. Gray water pushed against the dock in short, hard waves. My mother called 7 minutes later. I did not answer. That Sunday, I drove to my parents' house for dinner. Helen had set the dining table with the blue china she used whenever she wanted a family discussion to look like a celebration. Pot roast steamed in the center. Butter melted into a bowl of mashed potatoes, and rosemary scented the room. Brielle sat across from me, turning her engagement ring around her finger. Ethan was beside her. Douglas carved the roast without looking up. My mother waited until everyone had food. "Allison," Helen said, "Brielle tells me you were uncooperative about the lake house paperwork." Ethan paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "What paperwork?" he asked. "Nothing important," Brielle said quickly. "Just wedding logistics." I cut a piece of carrot. "Wedding logistics do not require a deed." Douglas set down the carving knife. "That house has always been family property," he said. "You know that." I placed the fork beside my plate. "My property." His gaze lifted to mine. The grandfather clock in the hall struck once. The sound rolled through the dining room and faded. Helen reached for the gravy boat. "No one is challenging ownership," she said. "We are talking about use. You have more space than you need, and your sister is beginning a new life. My space does not become available because Brielle is getting married." Brielle leaned forward. "You act like I'm asking for something outrageous. You asked for my deed, for information. Then tell me exactly what the information is for." Color rose along her neck. Ethan looked from Brielle to me. "Is there some plan involving the house that I don't know about?" My mother passed him the gravy. "This family has always shared what it has," Helen said. "Allison has forgotten that." I picked up my water glass, but did not drink. "Send every request to me in writing." Brielle's lips parted. "What?" Write down exactly what you want, why you want it, and who needs it. Douglas pressed his napkin to his mouth. There is no reason to make this formal. Then there is no reason not to. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The roast cooled on my plate. 3 nights later, Brielle called again. This time, there was no wedding planner in the background. No music, no glasses. Only her voice. "The lake house should be my wedding gift," she said. I sat at my office desk with a shoreline repair plan open in front of me. A desk lamp cast a white circle across the measurements. "What makes you think that?" "You live alone," Brielle said. "Ethan and I want children. The house was meant for a family. It is my home. You have money. You can buy another one." That is not an answer. Mom and Dad agree with me. The old ache above my knee tightened. I rotated my foot beneath the desk, slow and controlled, until the muscle released. "What exactly are you asking me to sign?" I asked. Brielle hesitated. "A transfer." "What kind?" "I don't know all the legal terms." "Then find out." Her breath came through the phone in a sharp burst. "Why can't you do one generous thing without turning it into a fight? Send me exactly what you expect me to sign." "You already know what I mean. Put it in writing." She ended the call. The email arrived 12 minutes later. The subject line read, "Wedding Gift Confirmation." Brielle wrote that she expected me to transfer the lake house to her before the wedding so the property could support financing connected to their future household. She included a deadline. She also wrote that our parents considered the transfer a restoration of family balance. I read the message twice. Then I saved it in 3 places. 1 copy went to a protected folder on my computer. 1 went to encrypted cloud storage. The 3rd was printed and placed in a file labeled with the date. After that, I checked the county property portal. No new deed had been recorded. I checked the title alert service I had maintained for years. No recorded change. Then I opened the inventory for my safe deposit box. Certified deed. Consent judgment. Constructive trust order. Original settlement correspondence. I had learned a long time ago that peace of mind was not the same thing as trust. Peace of mind came from knowing where every document was before someone else claimed it had never existed. My next call went to Mara Ellison. She answered on the 4th ring. "What happened?" Mara asked. "Not hello. Not how are you. What makes you think something happened?" I asked. "You only call my direct number after business hours when your family is involved." I looked at Brielle's email on the screen. "She wants the lake house as a wedding gift." Mara was quiet for one breath. "Wants or says you agreed?" "She says the family expects it. Someone also asked for parcel information, insurance, and a copy of the deed." "Do not send anything," Mara said. "I haven't. Forward me the email. Do not accuse anyone of fraud. Do not tell them what records you have." "I wasn't planning to." "I know. I'm saying it because I prefer sleeping. Despite myself." The corner of my mouth moved. Mara's voice became more serious. "Check the title alerts. Check county records. Keep every message. If anyone contacts you about a transfer, get the caller's full information and ask for copies." I already started a log. "Of course you did." The next morning, the title company called. The same closing coordinator spoke more carefully than before. "Miss Mercer, I need to confirm whether your email address has changed." "No." "Do you still use the address ending in Mercer Engineering?" "Yes." Papers shifted near her receiver. "We received correspondence from another address represented as yours." "What address?" "I can't disclose the full file until our attorney reviews it." "Then note that I have not authorized any transfer, gift, affidavit, or deed involving my property." "I'll note that." "Please send me copies of every document bearing my name." Another pause. "I need approval before releasing the packet." "Then request approval." "I will." I wrote down the time, her wording, and the name of the supervising attorney she gave me. That afternoon, an email arrived from the title company. The attachment was a single PDF. I downloaded it without opening it first, saved the original, and made a copy for review. The first page was an owner's gift affidavit. The second page authorized the title company to communicate with a lender. The third page contained a signature. My signature. Every loop sat where it had once sat. Every slant matched. Even the narrow break in the final letter was there, but I had not written it. And beneath it, a notary acknowledgement claimed someone had watched me do so. The notary seal looked too clean. Real seals usually carried pressure. A faint ridge, a shadow where paper had been compressed. This one sat flat against the page, sharp at every edge, as if someone had pasted an image onto the document. I enlarged the PDF until the letters blurred. The signature was worse. Not shaky, not careless. Perfect. Too perfect. My current signature had changed over the years. The first letter leaned farther forward now, the final stroke cut upward instead of curling back. This version belonged to an older hand, one that had spent months relearning how to hold a pen after an accident. I printed the packet and placed it beside a contract I had signed the week before. The difference was obvious once both pages were under the same lamp. My phone rang before I could call Mara. She answered on the first ring. "Do not alter the file," Mara said after I explained what I had received. "Keep the original attachment exactly as it arrived." I saved it before opening the copy. "Good. Forward the original email to me. I'll ask the title company to preserve the native files, the full headers, and every attachment they received." I traced the outer circle of the printed notary seal without touching it. "The stamp looks inserted." "Maybe," Mara said. "But we don't decide that from a scan. We document what we see. Then let the right people examine it. I want to call Brielle." "No." The answer came so quickly that my hand stopped above the page. "She may not know how far this has gone," I said. "Then she can explain later. Right now, anyone involved needs to believe the packet reached the title company without warning you." A heating vent clicked beneath the floor. "You think they'll send more? I think people who believe you won't fight back often become careless." Mara's voice softened by half a degree. "Allison, protect the house first. Feel everything else later." Within an hour, the title company had written confirmation that no transfer would move forward without direct verification from me. Mara sent formal notice that I had not consented to any gift, deed, affidavit, or authorization. I activated an additional property fraud alert through the county system. Then I checked the public records portal again. Nothing new had been recorded. That should have steadied my breathing. It did not. The packet already existed. Someone had created it, signed my name, added a notary acknowledgement, and sent it toward a lender, as if my consent were a detail that could be supplied afterward. That evening, I reviewed the house access log. The smart lock recorded every entry by date, time, and code. My own code appeared throughout the week. A maintenance code showed once for the heating technician. Brielle's code appeared on a Tuesday afternoon while I had been inspecting a retaining wall in another county. 2 guest codes had been created minutes before her arrival. Both were used. I opened the exterior camera archive. Brielle appeared on the front walk wearing white pants and a pale blue blouse. 2 men followed her. One carried a leather folder. The other held a laser measuring device. She unlocked my door and waved them inside. 46 minutes later, the 3 of them walked around the rear deck. One man pointed toward the shoreline. Brielle spread both arms as though describing changes she intended to make. I watched the clip twice. Then I called her. "What did you do at my house last Tuesday?" I asked. Brielle did not answer immediately. "I stopped by, with 2 men. Her breath caught so softly I almost missed it. "They were wedding vendors," she said. "What kind?" "Why does it matter?" "Because you entered my home while I was away. Mom said the code still worked." "That does not answer my question." Brielle's voice rose. "They were checking the property, that's all." "For what? Parking, space, maybe photography?" "Give me their names. I don't have to report every conversation to you. You do when strangers enter my house." "You always do this," Brielle said. "You turn normal things into threats." I looked at the frozen camera image on my screen. One man stood near the foundation with the measuring device pointed at the house. "Send me their names in writing," I said. Brielle ended the call. The next morning, Helen summoned me to my parents' house. She called it a family conversation. Douglas called it a chance to correct the damage I had caused years earlier. Brielle sat beside our mother on the living room couch. 3 framed wedding photos were spread across the coffee table, though no one looked at them. Helen folded her hands. "You took that house once," she said. "Giving it back would finally heal this family." My father stared at me from his chair. The property was bought for family use, Douglas said. Transferring it to Brielle restores what was always intended. Are you willing to put that statement in writing? I asked. His jaw shifted. This is not a business meeting. Then stop making claims about ownership. Helen's fingers tightened together. We sacrificed everything after your accident, she said. Brielle lost years of attention. Your father nearly lost the company. And now, when your sister asks for one thing, you hide behind paperwork. I stood. Paperwork is the only reason anyone knows who owns the house. Back home, I opened the locked storage cabinet in my office. Old medical records filled one box. Release forms, therapy authorizations, insurance correspondence. Near the bottom, I found a medical release signed more than a decade earlier. My breath stopped. The loops matched. The narrow break in the final letter matched. Even the slight downward drag caused by my weak grip matched. The signature in the transfer packet had not been copied by someone watching me write. It had been lifted from this exact page. Mara compared the two scans that evening. Then her voice went quiet. Your mother had access to this exact page. The page smelled faintly of dust and old adhesive. When I lifted it from the folder, the paper rasped beneath my fingers. Somewhere below the office windows, water struck the stone seawall in slow, heavy slaps. Damp wood from the reading room shelves carried the same sour sweetness I remembered from the rehabilitation clinic. For 1 second, my office disappeared. I was 15 again, lying beneath a thin hospital blanket while rain tapped the glass. My left leg was wrapped from hip to ankle. Each time the physical therapist bent my knee, the room narrowed to ceiling tiles, rubber gloves, and the sharp smell of disinfectant. My mother sat beside the bed with a clipboard. Sign where I marked it, Helen had said. The memory released me when the furnace clicked on. I set the medical release beside the forged affidavit and opened the older accounting file. After the boating accident, the settlement money had not gone directly to me. A court-supervised account was created because I was a minor. Douglas became the person responsible for managing it. My parents called that protection. At 26, I requested the final accounting because a bank statement listed a company I did not recognize. Mercer Shore Holdings. The name appeared again on invoices for accessibility renovations, shoreline work, and a recovery residence. I had never recovered there. At the time those bills claimed I was living beside the lake, I was sleeping in a narrow bedroom at my parents' house and driving to therapy 3 mornings a week. I called Mara's predecessor the next day. Make copies before you ask your parents anything, the attorney told me. So I did. The forensic accountant traced payment after payment from my conservatorship through the family company and into the limited liability company that purchased the lake house. 2 years later, my parents agreed to a consent judgment rather than face a public trial. The house was transferred to me. They kept their primary residence and the business. I accepted a smaller repayment plan because selling the company would have cost employees their jobs. Brielle never knew that part. She only heard Helen's version. Allison used the accident to take our house, my mother told her. I heard those words through the kitchen doorway 8 years ago. Brielle had been crying. Helen held her shoulders and spoke as though comforting a child after a death. I walked away without correcting her. Silence had seemed kinder then. Now my sister believed the house was something I had stolen, not a fraction of what had been taken from me. I turned another page in the accounting file. An invoice authorized payment for accessibility improvements that had never existed. A signature sat at the bottom beneath a certification that the expense had been necessary for my care. Not Douglas's signature, Helen's. I checked the next invoice. Then another. My mother had not merely watched my father move the money. She had certified the lies. Helen's signatures changed the shape of my timeline. Until that morning, Douglas had occupied the center of every page. He had controlled the conservatorship, signed the major transfers, and repeated for years that the lake house belonged to the family. So I called him first. We met at a diner near his office. Coffee steamed between us. Silverware struck plates behind the counter, and the smell of burned toast clung to the air. Did you send the transfer packet? I asked. Douglas stirred his coffee without drinking it. Your mother was trying to fix this, he said. What was she fixing? The damage you caused when you took the house. I placed a copy of his recent affidavit on the table. Did you read this before signing it? His spoon stopped against the cup. Helen said it was not an ownership claim, Douglas said. She said it explained the family history. It says you retained a beneficial interest. That is not the same as legal title. Did you read the sentence above your signature? Douglas looked toward the window. I read enough. That answer followed me back to my office. By then, Mara had received the original email, the full headers, and the native attachment from the title company. We reviewed them during a video call. The author field says Helen Mercer, Mara said. The username is H. Mercer. The file was created the same evening your mother asked Brielle about the deed scan. So Helen made it. Not yet, Mara said. This shows the file came through her account and carries identifiers tied to her. It does not prove who sat at the laptop. What do we do next? We preserve everything. Mara sent notices covering the original files, server logs, and related devices. Before sunset, my phone began filling with family messages. Aunt Carol wrote that jealousy was an ugly thing in a sister. A cousin asked why I wanted Brielle homeless before her wedding. Helen had moved faster than any legal notice. I did not answer them. Instead, I made a list. Mara needed the documents. The title company needed my written denial. The lender needed confirmation that I had never consented. Everyone else could wait. That evening, the title company forwarded an email thread attached to the transfer file. Helen had written, Allison always folds when the whole family is in the room. Brielle replied, put the keys in front of her and let Mom talk. My fingers tightened around the printed page. The meeting had never been meant to clear up paperwork. It had been staged to make refusal look cruel. One final message sat beneath the others. Brielle had written it the next morning. She doesn't know I saw the signature. Brielle arrived at the lake house 20 minutes late. Her tires crushed gravel outside my office window, then stopped hard enough to throw small stones against the porch steps. A car door slammed. Fast footsteps crossed the deck. I had placed 2 folders on the dining table. One contained the email where Brielle demanded the house. The other held a comparison between the signature on the transfer packet and the old medical release. Nothing else. She came inside without waiting for me to answer the door. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and a cream wool coat hung open over her jeans. Why am I here? Brielle asked. I closed the front door behind her, to give you a chance to stop. Her gaze moved toward the folders. Stop what? I pulled out a chair. Sit down. I'm not a child, Allison. Then we should be able to have an adult conversation. Brielle stayed standing for another moment, then dropped her purse onto the chair beside her and sat. I opened the first folder. This is the email you sent me, I said. It says you expect the lake house to be transferred before the wedding. You asked me to put it in writing. I did. So why are we pretending this is some kind of crime? I opened the second folder and placed the 2 signatures side by side. Her eyes dropped to them, only for a second, but long enough. You knew, I said. Brielle folded her arms. I knew Mom had started paperwork. You knew the signature was not mine. She said it was temporary. A temporary forged signature? Brielle's mouth tightened. She said you would sign the real documents once everyone was together. The refrigerator motor started behind us. A dull vibration passed through the floorboards. That does not make the first signature legal, I said. You always make everything sound uglier than it is. Someone copied my name from a medical record. Brielle looked toward the windows. Outside, the lake had turned steel gray beneath the clouds. You got everything after the accident, she said. The words came quietly, not as a defense, as something she had carried for years. What did I get? I asked. Attention, money, special treatment. Brielle rubbed her thumb along the edge of the table. My birthday party was canceled because you had surgery. We left vacations early because your leg hurt. Mom missed school events. Dad was always fighting with insurance companies. Those things were true. I remembered her standing beside a half-decorated birthday cake while Helen packed a hospital bag. I remembered Brielle sitting alone in the back seat while my parents argued about medication costs. You were hurt too, I said. Her eyes returned to mine. Then why did you get paid for it? The muscles along my spine went rigid. Brielle leaned forward. You got a settlement. You got the house. Everyone built their lives around what happened to you. I got nothing. The old medical release lay between us. My 15-year-old signature slanted across the bottom. Weak and uneven, from a hand that still shook. That money was for my care, I said. And now you have a house worth millions. You do not know where the house came from. Because you never tell anyone anything. I let that sit between us. She was right about one part. My silence had left room for Helen to build an entire history. I slid the folders closer to myself. Here is your last chance, I said. Withdraw the transfer packet. Tell the title company and lender that I never consented. Correct whatever you told Ethan. Brielle styled at me. And the wedding? That is not part of my offer. We will lose deposits. That is not my responsibility. You could cover them. No. Her chair scraped backward. You bring me here, threaten me, and then refuse to help with the mess you created? I did not pledge my home for your financing. Her face changed. Not much. A slight widening around the eyes. A pause before she breathed. What financing? I asked. Brielle reached for her purse. Nothing you need to know about. I placed one hand on the folder. You told Ethan the house would be yours. She stood. We planned around it. How? Brielle pulled her coat closed. A bridge loan, she said. Temporary financing. The house was supposed to support it until everything settled. You used my property to secure wedding debt? No loan has closed yet. Because I have not signed. You were supposed to sign. The words struck harder than if she had shouted. Not hoped. Not asked. Supposed to. I rose from the table. This conversation is over. Brielle grabbed her purse. You are ruining my life. No, I said. I am refusing to finance it. She left through the front door and slammed it behind her. A minute later, the exterior camera showed her standing beside her car with a phone pressed to her ear. Her mouth moved quickly. One hand cut through the air toward the house. The camera did not record sound. I did not need it to. My phone rang before Brielle drove away. Mara's name appeared on the screen. Allison, Mara said when I answered. Your father just signed a new affidavit. I looked at Brielle's car disappearing through the trees. What does it say? Mara paused. It says your family still holds a beneficial interest in the lake house. Mara sent the affidavit while Brielle's taillights were still visible through the trees. I opened the file at the dining table. Douglas had signed beneath a statement claiming our family retained a beneficial interest in the lake house because it had been purchased, maintained, and used for shared family purposes. My father's signature looked heavy. The final stroke cut deep enough to show through the scanned page. He signed this today? I asked. Less than an hour ago, Mara said. He knows the deed says the opposite. He knows what the deed says, Mara replied. Whether he understands what this affidavit may do is another question. What can it do? If the lender relied on it, the issue is no longer limited to pressure inside a family. It becomes a false ownership claim connected to financing. I read the affidavit again. A muscle jumped above my knee. Can we stop the transfer without using the old judgment? I asked. Yes, Mara said. Your written denial and the disputed signature should be enough to halt this transaction. But they will call it a misunderstanding. They probably will. And Brielle will say Mom handled the paperwork. She probably will. The consent judgment sat inside a safe deposit box across town. Once I released it beyond my attorney and the title company, parts of my medical history and the stolen settlement money could enter a larger dispute. 8 years of silence had protected my privacy. It had also protected their version of the truth. Use the judgment, I said. Mara did not answer immediately. Are you certain? She asked. No, send it anyway. The next morning, the title company contacted the notary whose name appeared beneath my forged signature. By noon, Mara called back. The notary has never met you, she said. Her journal contains no entry under your name on the date listed. I gripped the edge of my desk. Is she involved? There is no evidence of that. Her commission information appears to have been copied from an older document. She is cooperating. Mara also asked for my work records from the date shown on the false acknowledgement. My inspection report placed me in another city, more than 100 miles away. Time-stamped photographs showed me standing beside a cracked seawall while someone supposedly watched me sign a deed at home. That evening, I began assembling the binder. The certified deed went first. Behind it, I placed the consent judgment and constructive trust order. Then Brielle's demand email. My written denial. Douglas's affidavit. The title company correspondence. signature comparison, smart lock logs, and printed images of Brielle leading strangers through my house. Each tab made a dry, snapping sound as I closed it around another page. Mara watched through a video call. "Include the confidentiality language from the settlement," she said. "It makes me look difficult. It shows you are not hiding terms that affect how the records can be used." I added it. Nothing in the binder was there to make me appear innocent. It was there to preserve sequence. Request. Refusal. False document. Pressure. Another false claim. My phone rang while I was indexing the final section. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I had never spoken to him without Brielle nearby. "Why is the title company delaying everything?" Ethan asked after I answered. His voice sounded low and strained. "You need to ask Brielle," I said. "She says you changed your mind." I never agreed. "She told me paperwork was already signed. Ask her whether I signed anything." Silence followed. A car passed behind him. Wind pushed across his phone. "Allison," Ethan said, "is my name on something I should know about?" "I cannot answer that for you." Another pause. "I understand," he said, though his voice suggested he did not. Helen called that night. "We are meeting with Daniel Price on Friday," she said. "Everyone will attend, and this confusion will be corrected." "I am not confused. You know what I mean. What is the purpose of the meeting?" "To clear up paperwork. I will not sign a deed." My mother released a tired breath. "Then come explain that to your sister's face." After the call, Mara told me I did not have to attend. "They already have your denial," she said. "You have no obligation to sit in a room while they pressure you." "I want to know what they say when a neutral attorney asks who authorized the transfer. That is not a legal necessity." "No. It is a record." Before agreeing to attend, I sent Daniel an email stating that I had never approved the transfer, would not sign any ownership document, and expected his office to preserve every file it had received. I printed the sent email and added it to the binder. On Thursday night, I set my keys beside it. The original deed remained locked away. Just after 10, my phone lit up with a message from Helen. "Tomorrow, you will finally do something for your sister." The keys felt colder the next morning. I carried them in one hand and the binder in the other as I entered Daniel Price's office. Metal pressed into my palm with every step. The lobby smelled of coffee, printer toner, and the lemon polish someone had used on the dark wood tables. Brielle was already inside the conference room. Her white garment bag hung from a brass hook near the door. Ethan sat beside her, shoulders stiff, both hands flat on the table. Helen had arranged herself between Brielle and Douglas, as though the seating had been chosen for a family portrait. Daniel stood when I entered. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Thank you for coming." Mara sat near the far end of the table. She gave me one small nod. I placed the binder beside her, but kept the keys. Brielle watched them land in my palm. Then she smiled. "Your wedding gift to me will be the lake house," she said. Her voice carried the same confidence as it had in every phone call. No request, no uncertainty. Helen clapped once. "There," my mother said. "Now we can finally move forward." Ethan turned toward Brielle. "You said this meeting was to correct a filing problem." "It is," Brielle said. "Allison is correcting it by signing." Daniel lowered himself into his chair. "No one is signing anything yet," he said. Brielle's smile flickered. I placed the keys on top of the transfer packet. Their weight pressed shallow dents into the page. "You live alone," Brielle said, looking at me. "You do not need 6 bedrooms. Ethan and I are building a family. This should not be complicated." My palm covered the keys. I pulled them across the paper toward me. The scraping sound cut through the room. Douglas shifted in his chair. "The house should stay in the family," he said. "It is in the family," I replied. Helen leaned forward. "Allison, we discussed this. Your sister has made financial commitments based on your cooperation." Ethan's head turned slowly. "What financial commitments?" he asked. Brielle picked up the black pen lying beside the packet. "The lender has approved everything," she said. "We only need the original signature." Daniel looked up. "Approved based on what?" Brielle glanced at Helen. My mother answered, "Based on the family's long-standing interest in the property." Daniel opened the certified title report. "Miss Mercer has denied that any shared interest exists." "That is her interpretation," Helen said. "It is not an interpretation," I replied. "It is in the deed." Daniel turned to the final page. His finger moved down the printed lines, then stopped. Mr. Mercer, he said. Please explain the reference to Mercer versus Mercer. Douglas stared at the page without reaching for it. That was settled years ago, Helen said. Daniel kept his attention on my father. Mr. Mercer? Douglas extended one hand and drew the deed closer. The room became quiet enough for me to hear the air moving through the vent above us. His gaze traveled across the first sentence. Then the second. This conveyance was made pursuant to the consent judgment and constructive trust order entered in Mercer versus Mercer. His mouth tightened. Daniel pointed lower. Read the next sentence. Douglas read it once. The skin above his collar lost color. He read it again. Grantors retain no legal or equitable interest in the property. His hand moved toward the affidavit near his elbow, then stopped before touching it. What did you sign? Ethan asked. Douglas did not answer. Helen reached for the deed. This old dispute has nothing to do with the wedding. Daniel placed his palm on the document. It has everything to do with a sworn statement claiming the grantors retained a beneficial interest. Brielle looked at her father. Dad? Douglas's eyes remained fixed on Helen. You said it was family history, he said. Helen's lips barely moved. It was. You said it was not an ownership claim. It describes how the house was used. Daniel closed the certified report halfway. It was submitted in support of financing, he said. That changes the context. Brielle pushed the pen toward me. Then sign the new deed, she said. Once Allison transfers it, none of this matters. Ethan stared at her. You told me she had already agreed. She did agree. No, I said. Brielle's hand froze over the pen. I opened the binder. The first page was my email sent before the meeting. I wrote that I had not consented, I said. I also wrote that I would not sign. Daniel read it, then placed it beside the packet. The next document was the certified deed. After that came Douglas's affidavit. Daniel aligned the pages. One says the grantors retained no interest, he said. The other claims the family still has a beneficial interest. Douglas rubbed his thumb against his index finger. Helen sat very still. I turned to the signature comparison. My name appears on the gift affidavit, I said. I did not write it. Helen gave a small, weary laugh. You have signed so many medical forms over the years. You probably signed this and forgot. I removed the old medical release. The copied signature sat beside the one in the transfer packet. Same weak downward drag. Same broken final letter. Same spacing. This signature came from this page, I said. Brielle looked at the table. Daniel examined both documents. Mara spoke from beside me. The original file also contains a notary acknowledgement, she said. The listed notary denies witnessing any signature by Allison Mercer. Her journal contains no matching entry. Daniel turned toward Helen. Who prepared the packet? I forwarded what Brielle gave me, Helen said. Brielle jerked her head up. Mom prepared it. Helen's gaze snapped toward her. You asked me to help. I did not create Allison's signature. Ethan pushed his chair back an inch. When did you know the signature was not hers? He asked Brielle. My sister's face tightened. Mom said Allison would sign in person. That is not what I asked, Ethan said. Daniel repeated the question. When did you know? Brielle looked at me. She was going to refuse no matter what. I removed the printed email thread. Her words sat near the bottom of the page. She doesn't know I saw the signature. Daniel read the line. Then Ethan read it. His breathing changed. Slower. Heavier. You knew before today, he said. Brielle reached for him. Ethan, listen. He pulled his hand away. Daniel closed the transfer file. This transaction is stopped, he said. No deed will be signed or recorded through this office. The lender will be notified that consent is disputed and that documents submitted in support of the transfer may be false. Helen rose halfway from her chair. You cannot destroy a wedding over paperwork. Daniel looked at her. I am stopping a property transfer. Your wedding arrangements are not within my authority. Mara slid a preservation notice across the table. All original emails, attachments, native files, and related records must be retained, she said. Douglas stared at his affidavit, as though it had changed while he was reading it. I closed the binder. Then I gathered my keys. No one tried to touch them this time. Outside the conference room, my hand had almost reached the lobby door when Ethan spoke behind me. I turned. He stood facing Brielle through the open doorway. His face had gone still. Tell me what you used our wedding money for, he said. Ethan's question followed me into the parking lot. Tell me what you used our wedding money for. The glass door closed behind me before Brielle answered. Through it, I saw her mouth move quickly. Helen stood and reached toward Ethan. Douglas remained seated, staring down at the affidavit bearing his signature. Mara joined me beside my truck. You do not need to stay for the rest, she said. I know. Inside, Ethan stepped away from Helen's hand. I unlocked the truck. 48 hours later, the bridge lender froze the application. By Monday morning, the wedding venue had requested the remaining balance in full. 2 vendors sent notices stating that deposits would be lost if payment deadlines passed. Brielle left 7 voice messages before noon. The first called the meeting a misunderstanding. The third blamed Daniel. By the 7th, her voice had gone hoarse. You knew this would happen, Brielle said in the message. You could have signed one piece of paper and prevented all of it. I saved every recording. Ethan moved out of their apartment that weekend. I learned that from Brielle, not from him. He packed a suitcase like I was some criminal, she said when I finally answered one call. You submitted my property as support for financing. Mom handled the documents. You knew the signature was not mine. Brielle's breathing filled the line. You wanted him to leave me. No. You humiliated me in front of him. I answered the questions you refused to answer. She ended the call. Helen began calling relatives before the title company finished its internal report. Messages arrived from people I had not spoken to in years. One aunt accused me of using a private legal dispute to destroy my sister's future. A cousin wrote that a decent woman would sacrifice a house before sacrificing family. I did not answer either one. Mara helped me prepare a short statement. I had not agreed to transfer the lake house. Documents bearing a signature I denied making had been submitted to a title company and lender. The matter was under review. Nothing about the accident, nothing about the hospital, nothing about the money taken while I was a minor. For 3 days, that was enough. Then the lender requested the consent judgment. Once it entered the formal review, the past stopped belonging only to me. A signature examiner completed a report showing that the transfer signature matched the old medical release with identical spacing and line defects. The title company opened a fraud file. Douglas and Brielle received requests for emails, loan records, and communications concerning the house. Helen was instructed to preserve her laptop. Her attorney objected. Mara answered with dates, file names, and the preserved email headers. Weeks passed. Court-authorized electronic review did not happen quickly. First came letters, then conferences, then limits on what could be collected. When a forensic image was finally made from Helen's laptop, the device remained sealed while copies were examined. The report arrived on a Wednesday morning. I read it in my office while rain slid down the windows. The old medical release had been opened on Helen's laptop shortly before the transfer packet was created. The signature image appeared in a temporary file. The quitclaim deed and gift affidavit had been created under her user profile, edited on the same device, and sent from her account. For months, metadata had pointed toward her. Now the file history followed her hands. Brielle came to the lake house 2 evenings later. No makeup, no engagement ring. I let her inside but did not offer coffee. She held several pages from the consent judgment. This says the house was bought with your settlement money, Brielle said. Yes. Dad told me the court gave it to you because you threatened the company. The court approved a settlement after my accountant traced the money. Her fingers crushed the edge of the page. Mom said you wanted revenge. I accepted less repayment, so the company would not be sold. Brielle lowered herself into a chair. You knew what they told me. Yes, and you said nothing. The clock above the fireplace clicked forward. That was my mistake, I said. I thought keeping the truth from you was protection. Her eyes lifted. You let me believe you stole from us. I did. Brielle swallowed. Then this is partly your fault. No. Her shoulders jerked. I kept the past from you, I said. That belongs to me. You learned the signature was false and continued anyway. That belongs to you. She stared at the judgment until the paper trembled. My phone rang after she left. Douglas's name appeared on the screen. When I answered, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Allison, he said, your mother is preparing a statement. What statement? Douglas breathed once into the receiver. She is going to say the entire transfer packet was my idea. Douglas came to my office the next morning. He looked older than he had at the title meeting. His coat hung loose across his shoulders, and the hand holding his hat trembled once before he pressed it still against his leg. "Helen created the packet," he said. I stayed behind my desk. "You signed the affidavit. She told me it was only family history. You chose not to read it." Douglas lowered his eyes. "She is going to blame me for everything. You were responsible for the conservatorship. That was years ago. The money was mine years ago." His mouth tightened. "I am asking you to keep this inside the family," Douglas said. "Call it a misunderstanding. Your mother is 64. I am 67. Think about what public accusations will do to us." The old request wore new clothes, but the shape had not changed. My pain, their protection, my silence, their reputation. "You are not asking me to protect the family," I said. "You are asking me to protect the people who heard it." Douglas leaned forward. "I am still your father, and I was still your daughter when you spent my settlement." He left without another word. Helen's attorney sent her statement 2 days later. It claimed Douglas had directed the transfer, provided the signature, and instructed her to assemble the documents. Mara read it across the conference table. "She is separating herself from the decisions," Mara said. I opened my evidence binder. Helen's signatures on the old accounting sat behind the medical release. The notary's written denial followed the empty journal record. Then came the forensic history showing the release opened on Helen's laptop before my signature appeared in the transfer packet. "She did this before," I said. "And now we can show the pattern," Mara replied. I authorized the full record, not selected pages, not the version that spared Douglas, not the version that protected Helen's image as the devoted mother who only followed instructions. Everything. The legal consequences unfolded over months. The transfer documents were declared void. The title company and lender recovered costs through civil claims and settlement. Helen and Brielle became responsible for legal fees and restitution tied to the false submission. Douglas was required to complete the old repayment plan and step away from the family company. No police arrived during dinner. No judge fixed my family in a single afternoon. Consequences came by certified mail, scheduled conferences, signed agreements, and numbers on statements that could no longer be explained away. The wedding did not happen. Ethan ended the engagement after reviewing the loan records. Brielle moved out of their apartment and stopped wearing the ring. I changed every lock at the lake house. Old access codes disappeared. The family calendar no longer listed holiday weekends or summer visits. A written notice made the rule plain. No one entered without an invitation from me. By spring, the room Helen had called wasted space became my project office. Drafting tables faced the water. A younger engineer stayed in the guest room during a shoreline restoration job nearby. The house held work, books, meals, and people I chose. Brielle visited once. She stood on the porch with both hands inside her coat pockets. "Do you think you will ever forgive me?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. Her eyes moved toward the door. "Does that mean I can come for Thanksgiving?" The keys rested in my palm. For years, I had treated access as proof of love. Anyone, called family, could enter, take, and demand. Not anymore. "Not until an invitation comes from me," I said. Later, I returned the certified deed to the safe deposit box. The keys came home with me. The lake house was no longer evidence of an accident, a lawsuit, or everything my parents had taken. It was the life I had built after I stopped protecting them from the truth. And after I finally protected myself from their lies. This story reminds you that protecting your family should never require you to surrender your safety, property, dignity, or right to tell the truth. When someone asks you to sign financial or legal documents, do not rely on promises, pressure, or family loyalty. Read every page, request everything in writing, save messages, verify signatures, and speak with a qualified professional before agreeing to anything. A loving relative will respect your need for clarity. A person who becomes angry because you ask questions may be afraid of what those questions will uncover. You should also remember that silence does not always keep the peace. Sometimes it gives other people the freedom to rewrite history and make you carry the blame for what they did. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Refusing to pay for another person's choices is not selfishness. Forgiveness, when it comes, does not require you to return the keys, erase the consequences, or restore access to your life. Have you ever stayed silent to protect someone who later used that silence against you? Has a relative pressured you to give up money, property, or peace in the name of family? What boundary did you finally set? And what happened when you stopped explaining yourself?